What the? Dude, hold.
I'm a fisherman, and the most dangerous fishing trip of my life started when I filmed a Bigfoot swimming across the lake. 1 minute, I was alone on the water, and the next, the Sasquatch was doing something so morbid, nobody believes me when I retell the story. Today, we're going back to that horrifying morning where Bigfoot proved that he is a monster, unlike any other we've witnessed before. My name is Todd, and I've worked construction for about 20 years. Long weeks, early mornings. By the end of the day, you're usually sore, tired, and ready to be anywhere else. Fishing is what I do when I need to get away from all of that. I always bring a camera when I go out by myself. You could say it's for my fishing YouTube channel or my future career as an influencer. Nah, I work construction. By the time the weekend rolls around, my back already has enough complaints without me trying to film content. The real reason is a lot less exciting. I fish remote water mostly, places where you're not getting a signal, no matter what carrier you're using. On August 3rd, 2024, I filmed Bigfoot swimming across that lake. I'd been out on the water since before 6 that morning. By then, I already had a decent catch on the stringer, a few lines working different spots, and several hours of doing what fishing mostly consists of, waiting. Honestly, that's half the reason I like it. Nobody needs anything from you. The next thing I remember is waking up to the boat rocking beneath me. Something was moving in the water. I grabbed the side of the boat and sat up. Whatever had woken me was already moving away, heading toward the far side of the lake. For a second, I thought maybe a big fish had hit one of my lines and pulled the boat around. Then I got a better look at the disturbance in the water. That wasn't a fish. I checked my lines anyway. Everything looked normal. Most of whatever it was stayed underwater. From where I was sitting, all I could see was a dark shape moving across the lake. My first guess was a bear. Bears can swim, and I've seen them cross water before. Then I thought maybe it was a dog. The problem was that it didn't move like either one. The camera was already running. I remember looking over at it, then back at the thing in the water, thinking I'd probably want footage of whatever this turned out to be. The farther it got across the lake, the more I could see of it. It was riding higher in the water now, and that's when the way it swam started getting my attention. It was too smooth, too controlled. Most animals crossing open water look like they're trying to get to the other side as quickly as possible. This thing wasn't. It moved at the same steady pace the entire time, like swimming across the lake was no effort at all. And then I noticed the arms. Whatever I was looking at, it wasn't paddling with 4 legs. It was swimming with 2 arms. That's when I stopped telling myself it was an animal. It was Bigfoot, swimming across my lake like it owned the place, which, looking back on everything that happened after, it basically did. By that point, I wasn't interested in getting any closer. I reached over and started the engine, not because I was trying to outrun it, but because putting a little distance between us suddenly seemed like a good idea. The second the motor turned over, Bigfoot changed direction. Up until then, it had been heading toward the far side of the lake. It wasn't moving fast, and it wasn't paying any attention to me as far as I could tell. Then the engine started, and it turned around and began swimming toward the boat. The change was immediate enough that I noticed it before I even had time to wonder whether starting the motor had been the right call. I remember watching it for a few seconds, expecting it to turn away again. The sound of the engine had probably caught its attention. At least, that was the explanation I settled on at the time. So I pulled the throttle back and let the boat drift. I figured that if I sat still for a minute, it would lose interest and continue on its way. Instead, it held the same course. As the boat drifted and the lake stayed quiet around me, Bigfoot kept swimming straight in my direction. I watched it for another minute or two, and that's when I started noticing something I hadn't before. Every time the boat shifted position, Bigfoot adjusted with it. The changes were small enough that I probably wouldn't have noticed them if I hadn't been staring directly at it. But they were there. The boat would drift a little, and a few seconds later, Bigfoot would make a correction of its own. Then it would happen again. That was the point where the explanation I'd been holding on to started falling apart. Bigfoot had already been crossing the lake before I started the engine. It already had a direction. Then it turned around, and ever since then, it had been making small adjustments to stay lined up with the boat. By then, Bigfoot was close enough that I could clearly see its head and shoulders above the water. Bigfoot went under without any warning. 1 second it was there, still heading toward the boat, and the next it slipped beneath the surface. No splash, no sudden movement. It just disappeared. A few seconds later, the lake looked completely still again. I kept watching the spot where it went down, expecting it to come back up. That seemed like the obvious thing it would do. If something is swimming toward you and goes underwater, you expect it to surface somewhere along the same path, but nothing came up. I kept my eyes on that part of the lake for a while, then started looking farther out. Maybe it had changed direction underwater. Maybe it had surfaced somewhere I wasn't expecting. The water stayed flat everywhere I checked. I kept waiting for it to surface again. It never did. At least not where I was looking. It came up on my left, not where I'd been watching, not even close. Somehow it had changed direction underwater without me tracking it at all. By the time I caught the movement and turned my head, it was already there, off the side of the boat. The first thing that struck me was how little water it disturbed coming back up. Something that size should have made a lot more commotion. Instead, it surfaced almost quietly, like it had done it 1,000 times before. It was close enough that I could see it clearly for the first time. I glanced at the engine, then back at Bigfoot. At that point, I wasn't interested in getting a better look or figuring out what it wanted. I just wanted the boat moving. I got the engine running and pushed the throttle as far as it would go. At first, I thought that was going to be the end of it. The boat picked up speed, the distance started opening up, and when I looked back, Bigfoot was still sitting where I'd left it. For a few seconds, I actually thought I'd made the right call. Then I looked back again. Bigfoot was moving. What bothered me wasn't that it had started following me again. It was how quickly it was moving through the water. I've spent enough time around water to know what swimming is supposed to look like. This didn't look like any person or animal I'd ever seen. The boat was running hard, but the distance between us wasn't growing the way it should have been. Every time I checked over my shoulder, Bigfoot was still there, not falling behind, not giving up, just moving through the water at a pace that didn't make any sense. I pushed the boat harder. Bigfoot matched it. I cut left, trying to create an angle that might work in my favor. Bigfoot adjusted. Every move I made, it had an answer for. Every time I looked back, it was still there, not gaining much, not falling behind either, just staying exactly where it wanted to be. After a few minutes of that, I had to accept something I really didn't want to accept. I wasn't going to outrun it on this lake. I'd already gotten a good look at Bigfoot beside the boat. With both of us moving across open water, though, I had more time to actually see it. I knew it was big. I just hadn't realized big apparently went all the way up to that. I work construction. Estimating dimensions is part of the job, and this thing was enormous. The shoulders alone looked wider than they had any right to be. The arms were even stranger up close. Every stroke covered an unbelievable amount of distance, which explained why it had no trouble staying with the boat. And there was a lot more of it above the water than I'd realized. From a distance, I'd only been catching pieces of it. Up close, there was no mistaking the scale. The head, the shoulders, the length of the arms, everything about it looked oversized. I already knew I was looking at Bigfoot. Getting a better look didn't make it any easier to believe. At some point, Bigfoot stopped trying to keep pace with the boat and started pulling ahead of it. The first time it happened, I didn't think much of it. It moved out in front of me, disappeared, underwater, and I figured it had finally decided to break off and go somewhere else. A few seconds later, it came back up directly in my path. I turned the boat and went around it. Bigfoot stayed on the surface long enough for me to clear past, then disappeared underwater again. A few minutes later, it did the same thing again. Then it happened again after that. Every time I picked a direction, Bigfoot somehow ended up there first. It would surface ahead of me, force me to change course, then disappear and do it again somewhere else. After a while, it started feeling less like a chase and more like I was losing a game I didn't know I was playing. I remember looking past it toward open water and trying another angle. A minute later, Bigfoot was back in front of me. That was when I stopped thinking about where it was. I started paying attention to where it kept making me go, and every time I changed course, I found myself getting pushed back toward the same stretch of shoreline I'd been fishing near all morning. By that point, I had stopped trying to understand why Bigfoot wanted me near that stretch of shoreline. I was too busy trying to stay ahead of it. The chase kept going. Every time Bigfoot disappeared underwater, I found myself looking ahead, waiting to see where it was going to surface next. Most of the time, I wasn't wrong. It would come up, force me to adjust course, then vanish again before I could get anywhere near it. At one point, it surfaced close enough that I got another good look at it. Not close enough to touch the boat, but close enough that I could clearly see where it was looking. For the first time since this started, its attention shifted away from me. Just for a second. Its head turned slightly, and its eyes dropped toward the water beside the boat. Then it looked back at me and kept moving like nothing had happened. I noticed it because it stood out. Up until then, Bigfoot had seemed completely focused on where I was going and what the boat was doing. That was the first time I'd seen it pay attention to anything else. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Looking back, I probably should have. A few minutes later, Bigfoot surfaced again, and this time something was different. Instead of getting ahead of the boat, it came up alongside it. For the first time since the chase started, its attention wasn't on me, it was on the stringer. The fish had been trailing beside the boat all morning. I'd caught them hours earlier and barely thought about them since. At that point, staying out of the water seemed a lot more important than whatever I'd caught. Bigfoot angled toward them. At first, I thought it was just another course change. Then, it reached out with one of those long arms and grabbed the stringer. The whole thing happened so fast I barely had time to react. One moment the fish were beside the boat. The next, they were gone. Bigfoot ripped the stringer free, turned away from me, and started heading toward shore. Just like that, the chase stopped. I watched it swim away, carrying every fish I'd caught that morning. Under normal circumstances, that would have been the worst fishing trip of my life. Instead, I was seriously considering throwing in the tackle box for free. It felt like the best trade I'd ever made. I didn't waste any time testing the theory. The second Bigfoot turned away, I kept the boat moving and put as much distance between us as I could. Every few seconds, I'd look back, expecting it to change its mind and come after me again. It never did. Bigfoot swam straight toward the shoreline, carrying the fish. From where I was, I couldn't see exactly what it was doing once it got there. The bank was lined with trees and brush, and after a while, all I could make out was its shape near the water's edge. Then even that stopped moving. For the first time since waking up to the boat rocking, nothing was happening. No course changes. No giant shape cutting through the water toward me. No wondering where it was going to surface next, just a lake. I slowed the boat down and kept watching the shoreline. Bigfoot stayed there. Whatever it was doing, it didn't seem interested in me anymore. Maybe it had been the fish. The more I thought about it, the more that explanation started making sense. The fish were the only thing I'd brought into that lake that morning. Maybe the chase had never been about me at all. I wasn't completely relaxed, but I could feel the tension starting to drain away. Losing the fish suddenly felt like a pretty good deal. I sat there watching the shoreline for a while, waiting to see if anything else was going to happen. Nothing did. Bigfoot stayed out of the water. The boat drifted. The engine idled. Little by little, the whole thing started feeling less like an active emergency and more like something I might actually get away from. If I was smart, I probably would have left right then and never come back to that lake. Instead, I kept watching. After everything that had happened, part of me wanted to know what Bigfoot was doing over there and why the fish had suddenly mattered so much. For several minutes, nothing changed. Then I saw movement. At first, I thought Bigfoot was just shifting position near the shoreline. A second later, I realized it was heading back toward the water. I watched it step in and start swimming away from shore. The first thing I told myself was that it was probably leaving. Maybe it had what it wanted and was heading somewhere else. That explanation lasted right up until I realized the direction it was swimming. It wasn't heading down the shoreline. It wasn't crossing to the far side of the lake. It was coming back toward me. The fish were gone. Bigfoot had them. I remember thinking, "You already took my fish, man. What else do you want?" The closer Bigfoot got, the harder it became to hold on to the idea that any of this had been about the fish. If the fish were the problem should have been over. It had them. I'd given them up without a fight. As far as I was concerned, the transaction was complete. Bigfoot apparently had a different opinion. I started the boat moving again and tried putting some distance between us. Bigfoot answered by changing direction and matching me almost immediately. Not chasing the way it had earlier, not trying to cut me off, just staying close enough to make it clear that leaving wasn't going to be as simple as pointing the boat in the opposite direction and driving away. By then, I'd spent enough time watching its behavior to know there was a reason for it. Nothing about what it had done that morning felt random. The course changes. The way it kept steering me back toward the same section of shoreline. The fish. Now this. The fish had mattered. But they hadn't mattered enough to explain everything else. That was when it finally hit me that Bigfoot wasn't protecting the fish from me. It was protecting something else. I just didn't know what. Once that idea got into my head, I couldn't stop looking toward that section of shoreline. I still couldn't see anything unusual over there, but I was starting to believe there was a reason Bigfoot cared so much about keeping me away from it. I didn't get much time to think about it. Bigfoot disappeared underwater again. At that point, that was almost worse than seeing it. Every time it went under, there was a few-second window where I had no idea where it was or what it was about to do next. I was still scanning the surface when something slammed into the side of the boat. The impact wasn't enough to flip the boat or cause any real damage, but it hit hard enough to shove the entire thing sideways across the water. I grabbed the seat with one hand and nearly lost my footing anyway. For a second, I thought I'd hit something submerged. Then I looked over the side. Bigfoot was right there. One arm was still against the hull. That's when I realized it hadn't been an accident. It hadn't brushed the boat or bumped into it while swimming. Bigfoot had put its hand on the hull and shoved the boat. And if that was supposed to be a warning, it got the message across pretty clearly. I'd spent the entire morning hoping Bigfoot would leave me alone. Apparently, Bigfoot had reached the same conclusion about me. I pushed the throttle forward and tried putting some distance between us again. Bigfoot disappeared underwater almost immediately. For a few seconds, I lost sight of it completely. Then something hit the bottom of the boat. The impact came from directly underneath me. The bow lifted, the entire boat lurched upward, and then slammed back down into the water hard enough to throw gear across the deck. One of my tackle boxes tipped over. A rod came loose and bounced against the side of the hull. I got thrown sideways and had to grab the seat to keep from going down. I'd spent enough time around boats to know the difference between hitting something and being hit by something. I'd definitely just been hit. The shove earlier had moved the boat. This hit felt like something had tried to lift it out of the water. The boat rocked hard for several seconds before finally settling back down. I looked over one side, then the other, expecting to see Bigfoot somewhere nearby. There was nothing. A few moments earlier, I knew exactly where it was. Now it could have been anywhere under the boat. I kept looking over the side, trying to spot some sign of where Bigfoot had gone. The water looked completely normal. If it hadn't just hit the boat from below, I would have had no reason to think anything was under me at all. That's when I noticed the engine wasn't sounding right. The impact had rattled the entire boat, and apparently the motor along with it. I pushed the throttle and got almost nothing back. The engine sputtered, struggled for a few seconds, and then died completely. I tried starting it again a couple of times, but the engine wasn't interested. At that point, I was sitting in the middle of the lake with a dead motor and a Bigfoot somewhere underneath me. If there was ever a time for it to leave, that would have been a great time. I was reaching for the ignition again when the water beside the boat suddenly moved. Bigfoot surfaced so close that I instinctively pulled back. One hand came up over the side of the hull, then the other. Before I could fully process what I was looking at, it wrapped both hands around the edge of the boat. At first, I thought it was trying to pull itself aboard. That idea disappeared pretty quickly when I noticed the boat had stopped moving. The wind was still pushing across the lake, and the water was still shifting beneath me, but the boat wasn't drifting anymore. It was sitting in exactly the same spot. I leaned over the side and looked down. Bigfoot wasn't climbing into the boat. It was holding the entire thing in place. I don't know how long Bigfoot held the boat there. It probably wasn't very long, but when you're sitting in a dead boat watching something like that, grip the side of it, time starts feeling a little different. I stayed where I was and watched it, mostly because I wasn't sure what else to do. The engine was dead. The boat wasn't moving. Bigfoot had both hands on the hull and seemed perfectly content to keep it that way. Then it shifted its grip. At first, I thought it was letting go. Instead, it pushed down on the side of the boat. The hull dropped hard toward the water, and everything on deck immediately slid in that direction. I grabbed for the nearest seat and managed to catch myself for a second, but the boat kept leaning. Before I could recover my footing, Bigfoot pushed again. That was enough. My feet came out from under me, and I slammed into the side of the boat. A second later, I was going over it. The water hit a lot harder than I expected. One moment, I was in the boat, and the next, I was completely underwater. I swallowed a mouthful of lake water, lost track of which way was up, and spent a few seconds flailing around before instinct finally took over. I kicked for the surface as hard as I could. When my head broke above the water again, the first thing I realized was that I wasn't in the boat anymore. I was in the lake. The first thing I did was look for the boat. That probably sounds obvious, but when you unexpectedly go into the water, your brain narrows down pretty quickly to whatever seems most important. At that moment, the boat was the only thing I cared about. It wasn't far away. I'd gone over the side, not flown across the lake. A few good strokes, and I probably could have reached it. Then I saw where Bigfoot was. It was still beside the boat. For a second, I just stared at it, trying to process what I was looking at while treading water. Everything had happened so fast that my brain was still catching up. 1 minute, I was in the boat trying to restart the engine. The next, I was floating in the water, looking at the thing that had put me there. What really got my attention wasn't that Bigfoot was close. It was where it had positioned itself. The boat was directly behind it. There wasn't any other way to look at it. If I wanted to get back aboard, I had to go through the same stretch of water Bigfoot was occupying. The closer I looked, the harder it became to convince myself that it was an accident. Bigfoot wasn't splashing around or acting aggressive. It wasn't making noise. It was just sitting there between me and the boat, watching me. I've had some bad days on the water before. Boats break, the weather turns, people fall overboard. None of those situations involved a Bigfoot standing between me and the only thing keeping me out of the lake. And at that moment, I honestly couldn't think of a worse place to be. I kept my eyes on Bigfoot and tried not to think too much about how exposed I was. The boat was right there, close enough that I could have reached it pretty quickly under normal circumstances. The problem was that nothing about that morning had been normal for a long time. Bigfoot hadn't moved. It stayed between me and the boat, watching me while I treaded water a short distance away. Every few seconds, I'd glance toward the hull and then back at it, trying to figure out whether making a run for the boat was a brave decision or an incredibly stupid one. Then a sound came from the shoreline. I've spent most of my life outdoors, and I've heard plenty of animal sounds. This one sounded different. There was an urgency to it. It wasn't especially loud, but it carried across the water clearly enough that I heard it and immediately looked toward shore. So did Bigfoot. The reaction was instant. Its head turned toward the trees and stayed there. For the first time since I'd spotted it crossing the lake, its attention was completely somewhere else. Whatever had made that sound mattered more than I did. I didn't know what I was hearing. I didn't know what had suddenly pulled its focus away from me. What I did know was that Bigfoot was no longer looking in my direction. After everything that had happened that morning, I wasn't about to waste an opportunity like that. The second its attention shifted, I started swimming for the boat. I didn't waste any time wondering what had made that sound on shore. The only thing that mattered was that Bigfoot wasn't looking at me anymore. I swam for the boat as hard as I could. The distance wasn't far, but everything feels farther when you're in the water and trying to beat something's attention back to you. I kept expecting Bigfoot to turn around. Every few strokes I'd catch myself thinking about it and immediately force myself to focus on the boat instead. By the time I reached it, I was completely out of breath. Getting back aboard wasn't pretty. I grabbed the side of the hull, kicked until I got enough leverage, and hauled myself over the edge. I landed hard on the deck, rolled onto my hands and knees, and went straight for the ignition. The engine still wasn't cooperating. The first attempt got nothing. My stomach dropped. I tried again and got a sputter out of it, but not much else. For a second, I thought I was about to spend the rest of my day explaining to a tow truck driver why I needed a pickup from a lake occupied by Bigfoot. Then the engine caught. I pushed the throttle forward immediately, and the boat surged ahead. Water started opening up between me and the shoreline, and for the first time since this started, I felt like I might actually get away. I kept the throttle down and pointed the boat away from shore. At that point, I wasn't worried about my gear, the fish, or even the camera. I just wanted as much distance between myself and that section of shoreline as I could get. For a while, I kept my eyes forward. Then I looked back. Part of me wanted to make sure Bigfoot wasn't still following me. Part of me wanted to know what had been worth all of that. The chase, the fish, the boat. Getting thrown into the lake. There had to be a reason for it. That's when I saw them. At first, I only noticed the Bigfoot that had spent the morning chasing me. Then movement farther up the shoreline caught my eye. A smaller Bigfoot stepped out from the trees. A second later, I spotted another one farther back. The larger Bigfoot remained closer to the water, while the smaller ones stayed near the tree line. One of them kept looking back toward the woods, and when I followed its gaze, I noticed movement deeper in the brush. Something was moving through the trees toward them. I couldn't tell what it was from that distance, but it was enough to explain the urgency in the call that had pulled Bigfoot's attention away from me. The second I saw them, everything that had happened that morning finally made sense. The fish, the way Bigfoot kept forcing me away from that particular stretch of shoreline, the sound from the trees that pulled its attention away from me. It hadn't been trying to hunt me. It had been trying to keep me away from them. I sat there for a few seconds watching the shoreline get smaller behind me. The farther away I got, the more unbelievable the whole thing felt. When I launched the boat that morning, this wasn't even remotely on the list of things I expected to see. Somehow, I ended up filming a Bigfoot swimming across the lake.